Saying that an anime put too much effort into its cinematography is, admittedly, a really weird and almost kind of ungrateful complaint to have. With so many shows basically paying no attention to more in-depth filmmaking at all, it's very quickly becoming an I'll take what I can get situation. And yet, as I was watching The Promised Neverland, I encountered many scenes where the cinematography and camera work just went way too far. I should clarify that I still think this is a good show and you should absolutely watch it. It adapts the narrative of the manga surprisingly well for how much content they crammed into such a short space. But when it comes to being an audio-visual work, it sort of misses the mark by getting too obsessed with having as much flair and movement as possible. Before moving on, I should clarify what I mean by cinematography and what The Promised Neverland was striving for in that regard. Cinematography is, in a broad sense, the art of making film, typically in reference to the production itself and everything that's being presented on screen. Shot composition, mise-en-scène, blocking, lighting, camera work, foley, soundtrack, all of these things work together to create what you're seeing and hearing when you watch a show. It's also much more complex than simply saying, how can I arrange everything to convey the plot as efficiently as possible? Because going in with that mindset often leads to a mostly forgettable production. Film is an art. But it's also a language, and certain concepts have well-known meanings in the context of film language. When you use those concepts without considering what they are generally understood to mean, it can unintentionally confuse the audience. For example, there's this scene where Emma, Norman, and Ray are talking to each other alone in the middle of the forest, and the camera is viewing them through holes in a bush and darting between whoever's currently speaking. Typically, this perspective and style of movement is indicative of a point of view shot, meaning that the view is one that an in-universe character is directly seeing, and so I thought it was trying to say someone was looking at them through the bushes. But that wasn't what actually happened in the scene. It was just a unique way of viewing the situation in order to spice it up and add some variation to it. Now, much like actual language, film language isn't set in stone and can have multiple meanings. But POV shots are a pretty basic tool that have been around for decades, so it's kinda difficult to separate the film language from the shot itself and pretend like it's just a neat trick they were doing with the camera. The context of the story at large is also important in deciphering film language. The Promised Neverland is a psychological thriller where the lives of our main characters are at stake and they only have a limited amount of time to escape. Paranoia is an essential element of the show's plot, so when you create a shot that looks almost exactly like a POV of someone hiding in the bushes, the audience is going to think that someone is spying on the characters. Betraying that expectation like it wasn't supposed to be read that way creates a disconnect that throws the audience off. Weirdly enough, there are several more POV shots later that actually are POVs, each with a varying degree of effectiveness. There's this shot of Emma and the others ascending a staircase, but there's no clear motivation for why they wanted a POV here. It's an extremely long take, but it doesn't build up any tension since there's no context to it. It's just kinda there to be a POV. Now, a much better use of POV can be found when Sister Crone confronts Emma and the others. We see her looking at them through a hole she forms with her fingers, signifying that she views them as being entrapped and that she now has total control over them, which fits perfectly with the overall tone being conveyed. And this leads us back to the all-important question. What is this adaptation going for in terms of tone? Keep in mind that The Promised Neverland is a weekly Shonen Jump manga. This is something you'd see sandwiched between My Hero Academia and Dr. Stone if you were reading it in the magazine. So while the genre might be radically different, there is a general style and writing structure that it shares with other Jump properties. However, for this anime adaptation, it appears as though they wanted to narrow in on everything except the parts that make it feel like Shonen Jump, something that I predicted way back in my winter seasonal preview video. More specifically, this adaptation removed the more explanatory elements of Jump's writing style. Those pages and pages of characters thinking incessantly and following a train of complex logic and power systems in order to discover the right solution are either severely truncated or absent entirely in this anime. Thus, the more serious and oppressive tone of the series is allowed much more prominence and basically becomes a blanket tone for the entire series. Even when there are moments of comedy, it never turns into a cutaway gag that disrupts the flow of the scene. The tone has become much more homogenized, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Considering how much this portion of the story needed to be condensed down to fit in a single season, simplifying the plot and removing non-vital details allowed the anime to maintain a strong sense of pacing that never felt like the escape process dragged to a halt. Everything is constantly moving forward as the looming threat slowly closes in on the children. Sometimes it's able to communicate this idea through cinematography in an extremely effective manner. This shot where the camera is moving like a clock pendulum in sync with the sound of an actual clock is pretty brilliant. Emma has just discovered the true nature of Grace House and the fact that she's being raised as food for demons. And after deciding to escape with everyone, we now have the more metaphorical ticking clock of Emma racing to figure out a way to let everyone escape, being supplemented by a physical ticking clock in the room. And because there's no extra internal narration over the top of it like there is in the manga, it allows the tension of the scene to build up without interruption. And yet, they couldn't seem to leave well enough alone, because the same type of shot is used later in the series when Norman and Ray are discussing something, but based on the dialogue, there's no urgency or impending doom being felt here, so it doesn't work this time. You could argue that it's an echo of the previous scene to remind the audience of the danger, but it's a pretty weak echo considering how little it ties in with the relevant themes. Aside from the visuals, the soundtrack has quite a few issues as well. Because of the decision that the overall tone should be less variant, the soundtrack supports this practice, with most of the tracks having a noticeable emotional significance to them. Everything feels much more moving and symphonic than the average anime OST, and on its own, that's great. Having a soundtrack with more effort put into it is always a plus. What's not great is how the soundtrack is inserted into each scene. There are several scenes that don't feel like they were supposed to be huge emotional moments based on the dialogue and framing, so it feels completely out of place when you hear weeping violins pouring over the top of everything. Yes, there are some scenes where the soundtrack melds perfectly with the story beats, like the big reveal at the end of the first episode, but these moments seem almost equal in number to those where the soundtrack blares over something that's of little consequence by comparison. Despite how competently paced and well animated this show is, it reeks of not fully understanding what it's trying to say in regards to cinematic language. And this is most clearly seen in Sister Crone and how she is portrayed in the anime versus the manga. In both versions of the story, Sister Crone is an incredibly intimidating figure, as per the extreme details of her character design, her flamboyant movements, and her tendency to get up close and personal. In these aspects, the anime succeeds in creating an intimidating enemy for the children to fight. However, there's one crucial detail that the anime misses almost entirely, and that is her cinematic relationship with Isabella. In the manga, most of the moments where Crone and Isabella are in the same panel have Isabella physically above Crone, despite Crone actually being taller. Relative height is typically used in cinema as a means of conveying dominance or submission, and it's no different here. Crone might be an intimidating force against the children, but she's nothing compared to Isabella, and so she eventually meets her doom at Isabella's hands, realizing how entirely outclassed she had been the entire time. Unfortunately, the anime doesn't seem to recognize the manga's clever use of blocking. Sister Crone is taller than Isabella, so they just go with that and have her stand above Isabella throughout most of the series, which completely destroys both the power balance between these two characters and Isabella's power over the rest of the cast. By portraying Isabella as being equally threatening as Crone, it dismisses Isabella's importance and how much pressure she's putting on the children. Without this dynamic, the eccentricities of Crone's character, which seem to be even more extreme now that they're animated, completely outpace Isabella's dominance. Of course, Crone's character has also been exaggerated by the story as well. This weird doll that she plays with in the early episodes isn't in the manga. This is anime original content, and its only purpose seems to make Crone come off as even more unhinged, which is something that this character definitely didn't need more of considering where she was already, but I digress. There are still plenty of moments where the cinematography is spot on and really delivers on something artistic and exciting, but they're ultimately drowned out by what appears to be a lack of subtlety and an unintentional disregard for certain themes found in the manga. Again, this doesn't make the anime bad. It's definitely still worth watching, but the missed cinematic potential is certainly disappointing to say the least. Special thanks to Jan Rogalski, Rourketon Joing, Christine Seibert, Tim Johnson, Call Me Catlord, Ember's fave roommate, Eugenio Mendoza, and all my other patrons for their generous support. My name is Ember, and I'll see you next time.